Hello everyone. Back in April, we celebrated being on YouTube for 5 years, and by coincidence, it also marks 10 years since we got our first orchid. So we wanted to make a video to mark the occasion in some way. We decided to talk a little about our journey growing orchids and other plants. Because of the channel, a lot of you were there for that journey in the last few years, but we still wanted to celebrate with a bit of a recap. Also, please bear with us, because we don't have a lot of footage from those early days, so this is a little more podcast style. We also asked you for some questions that relate to this subject, so we'll be using them to tell this very unremarkable story.
Our first question came from Wanda Shaw, who always leaves the nicest comments and pretty much got the ball rolling on the theme of this video. How did we get started collecting orchids, our motivation, and if we collect other types of plants?
So a little about our backgrounds. Jay grew up mostly in apartments and has always loved cacti and succulents since he was little. He had a few as a kid, and when we first started living together, we got him a few, and later they became quite the collection as well. As for me, I grew up with a huge garden and no gardener, so as you can imagine, as a young adult, I wanted nothing to do with plants. Even though one of my favorite things as a kid was running a plant hospital where I would quote-unquote rescue every cutting and offshoot and nurse them back to health, all the garden chores as a teenager left me pretty tired of anything green for a while. But I still found orchids, or in this case phalaenopsis, really beautiful, with their arching spikes of huge butterfly-shaped blooms.
And this was around 2010. So there wasn't a sad orchid section in the corner of every store. You would see some phalaenopsis on the counter of fancy places and sometimes in stores like IKEA, but only the big white and pink ones. By 2015, she had talked about wanting one for a while. We were at the supermarket and they were having a garden supply event for spring. So there was a huge tray of phalaenopsis and I told her to pick one as a gift.
They were, like always, the big white or pink ones, but I saw one tucked in the middle that was white like I wanted, but with smaller blooms with light speckling. For some reason I thought it looked more special, so we picked that one. Now that we grow a lot of phalaenopsis, I know it's probably a hybrid with a lot of Phalaenopsis stuartiana in it. And we still have that orchid to this day, and still love it. We started calling it Stewie when we figured out the stuartiana thing. A few weeks later, I was so enamored with my new orchid, Jay picked out another one for me at the same supermarket. This was right at the beginning of there being more plants and orchids at regular stores. And again, he picked one he thought I would love, very dark and purple. And that turned out to be a very famous hybrid that we also have to this day, the Coda Twinkle. And it was fragrant. At the time, my mind was blown.
With having orchids for the first time came the necessity of figuring out how to care for them. And with that came YouTube. We discovered a whole community of content creators that had a passion for these plants we had just barely discovered. We started watching, of course, Miss Orchid Girl, Rachel from Gardening at Duenza, Roger, Astrid.
And with that, we discovered a whole new world. What do you mean orchids aren't just the ones with the butterfly flowers? There's oncidiums and dendrobiums and cattleyas, and they're all epiphytes, and we have to grow them in bark.
This meant that we had to get bark and supplies. We found a garden center that had just opened a dedicated orchidarium and had proper orchid supplies. There we bought our mini mark and our first non-fel orchid. I think it was an Oncidium Twinkle. New names I had just discovered through YouTube. At this garden center, there were also these monthly meetings and workshops run by a local orchid society, so we started going to those as well.
YouTube also presented us with a world of online hauls, so we made our first order from Schwarter. They seemed magical to me at the time, that you can just order botanical species online and grow them in your living room. From that order, we still have the Phalaenopsis mani black and what was our first time trying a seedling, the Phalaenopsis bashi canary. It took 5 years to bloom, not the 2 it said on the website, and instead of the pretty speckled flower they advertised, they were just plain white. If that's not the quintessential seedling experience, I don't know what is. That autumn, I had a little collection going, still spread to our living room in humidity trays because the internet had me convinced a layer of wet pebbles were essential to my orchid survival. And then we went to our first orchid show in Lisbon.
We ordered some special plants from international nurseries, like Equigenera and Holke Orchidine. They have now merged into Equigenera Europe. And we also had a wonderful time chatting with Mr. Holke about orchids. He even gifted us a couple of seedlings. By 2016, the collection was undeniably a collection. So scattering more and more plants through the living room just wouldn't do it anymore. We had an empty space upstairs that was too wide to be just a hallway, but too narrow to be a living space. And so it became the new home for the orchids.
Since most were Phalaenopsis, I thought of displaying them in a more natural way, semi-hanging on the wall. So we got some cheap flooring boards, stained them white, and made a sort of trellis to hang them. Nowadays, with the houseplant boom, you can find plenty of ready-made ways to hang pots, but at the time, all we could do was DIY some hangers with some wire, pliers, and a lot of curse words. This space slowly but surely took shape as a dedicated orchid room. With added shelves for the seedlings, then for the orchids who didn't fit on the wall, then a desk for the repots, then some more shelves. Wanda asked us what was our motivation, and I guess the only answer is that these plants are fascinating, and that we're both exactly the type of people who would get hooked in a hobby that is ever expanding and has a lot of avenues to learn and explore. Still, orchids were always more my thing. And since we were spending so much time in garden centers, Jay's succulent collection was also growing a lot.
To answer this really thoughtful question by Julia, we consider both collections ours. Even though orchids were initially Isa's passion and succulents have always been more my thing, I really enjoy the orchids. I know all the names, and there's even some we keep because I like them more than Isa. Like the Mexillaria variabilis, that she can't stand the smell of. Or all the orange flowers that I love and she doesn't really care for. and she really helps with the succulents as well.
Except for repotting the cacti, because I say no thank you to prickly things. To finish Wanda's question, we do have some other houseplants. We used to have more, but when we moved I got rid of everything that wasn't looking great. Because we don't have a lot of space here, and I do see houseplants a lot more like decoration compared to orchids. I want them to look pretty in the house instead of growing them for the challenge or the experience.
We have plenty of pothos type houseplants, because those always look good hanging from shelves, and we really enjoy weirder looking houseplants like begonias and alocasias. We also want to pick a big houseplant for the corner of our living room, but we're having some difficulties committing on which one.
Yeah, it was really surprising to me when there was the houseplant boom in 2020 that everyone was going crazy for monsteras. In the islands where I'm from, they grow wild in backyards and people even eat the fruit, so to me they're nothing special.
We also got into growing carnivorous plants to help with pests and ended up really enjoying it.
I also have a bit of an African violet collection, going a bit by accident. In an orchid show we met a lady here that grows and sells fancy African violets, and we decided to make an order of some leaves to propagate, thinking they would not make it. And turns out each leaf can make many baby African violets. We have been sending violets to friends, family and neighbors ever since. Oh, and the Hoyas. We also have a few of those that we hung now in our laundry room, and they'll seem to like it here because they're all starting to bloom.
Back to our timeline, throughout the years we kept learning more about orchids. Going to shows, buying them from nurseries there, ordering online, and had to get rid of the hanging wall to make room for the much more space-efficient shelves.
That was a shame, because even though I love exploring other genera, phalaenopsis remained my main love, and by that time I had quite the collection of species, primary hybrids, and big complex hybrids I still found interesting or pretty.
Yes, you haven't become a complete orchid snob.
No, we even had what I think was a mandatory phase of collecting when we discovered the bargain bin sections at garden centers. Around that time where we were starting to see not only more varied phalaenopsis at bookstores, but also oncidiums and dendrobiums. I think a lot of our no-ID orchids are still from that era, where we got a lot of orchids for like €1 or €2.
It did come with some downsides though. That was also the era where we had to learn how to deal with pests and illnesses, and I think some of the culprits may have been those box store bargains. But we did learn a lot, and at least didn't lose a lot of money when they died.
That was the first time we had some big losses other than just a plant here and there. The collection was also getting very big very fast. And there was a while there where, between taking care of them being a bit stressful and us being busy with work and life, it ended up being the first time I got a bit burned out with orchids.
You still watered them, but I could see you weren't eager to do repots, or go to the garden center, or shows.
Then it was, I think, 2019, I remember it was before the pandemic, that I decided to do a big cleanup of the space, got rid of any orchid that was dead or halfway there, and some that I did not care anymore.
We reconfigured the space, and decided to get some grow lights to help with some that were being stubborn to flower. I remember at this time we already had some cattleyas and vandas, and they were not happy with our little window. At the time, all LED grow lights were really expensive, so I studied up and we decided to use some fluorescent aquarium lights. That worked like a charm. At the time though, some light palettes were being phased out, so getting all the parts was an adventure.
We eventually substituted them for LED kitchen lights that we found really cheap at Leroy Merlin. Having everything reorganized, all the plants cleaned up and repotted, I felt much more excited about the hobby again. You have to keep in mind, we both have plenty of other hobbies to steal the attention, so orchids have to keep themselves pretty interesting.
After the pandemic hit, we were watching some YouTube videos, and I'm pretty sure it was Roger that started it. But people were making little spotlight videos for what was being called the Global Virtual Orchid Show. And I thought, I have a camera that I use for photography, but it also shoots videos. Why not participate?
So we made our first spotlight video, and our first video ever, on our phalaenopsis stewartiana crossed with Finley. A wonderful hybrid reminiscent of that first supermarket orchid.
We enjoyed the challenge of getting decent footage of the orchids, and sharing it with an online community so much, we filmed a few more. We are both introverted people who don't have a lot of friends, so it was nice to share the hobby with like-minded individuals.
Then we saw a video trend of people doing an orchid count. And we wanted to participate, but that would mean speaking on camera. I hate speaking in public, I hate my own voice, but I wanted to participate so bad, I grabbed the camera and just talked.
From that, we kept finding other things that we wanted to share. Unboxing an orchid order, a tricky repot, a trip to the garden center. Before we knew it, we accidentally had an orchid and plant channel. And that became part of the hobby for us.
During the pandemic, work had slowed down a lot for us, so we were able to move the, again, growing collection to its own room. An extra bedroom where we kept a lot of our music equipment was cleaned up, the walls painted, and we got more of the cheapest IKEA shelves to house the orchids better.
We also invested in proper grow lights, some Barina strips, and some really strong Sanzi bulbs for the cattleyas. That was the Orchid Room we had until recently, when we moved to a smaller house.
By the time we were getting ready to move, the collection went through another period of neglect, this time because our life got a little crazy. Between Jay having health problems and us being away a lot to spend time with family, I think 2023 and 2024, the collection was pretty much kept with just the essentials. They were watered either by us or a neighbor and maintained when we were home, but no big orders, no repots.
We still enjoyed making videos a lot, so we filmed them when we could and made more series like the Orchid History, Orchids in Pop Culture, those that we could make anywhere.
This year, because of Jay's health, we moved to a smaller house in an area where we can have more quality of life. I expected that to mean that keeping orchids and the channel would be less important compared to less space-demanding hobbies. But to my surprise, we were able to keep all the orchids with space to spare, and I feel much less overwhelmed by them. They are in a much smaller space, and some of them are in really tall shelves that need a ladder to reach. But because we made accommodations, like having some of them in self-watering, I feel like they are a lot less work. There's also a lot to be said about being in a better space, physically and mentally.
I've also been slowly recovering my succulent collection. Unlike orchids, you can abuse them for 2 years and they'll survive, but they were looking pretty rough. So I've been going through them, selecting what I want to keep and repotting them into clay pots, because it gets windy here. And the first month after moving, we had to go pick up succulents in plastic pots from across the street at 3 a.m.
To answer this final question, what have we learned over these 10 years? Like I just mentioned, I learned to keep things fun. We grow these plants for our entertainment, and as much as we feel responsible for them, sometimes it's just good to step back. If you can't bring yourself to water them today, there's always tomorrow. I also learned the value of understanding the science of things. I've always been that kid that always annoys the teachers with the why questions, and I think Jay is the same. I've seen a lot of people wanting a cheat sheet for this. Use this magic powder, water twice a week, and then poof, flowers. And I find that it's much easier if you understand why they should be watered like this, why this substrate instead of that one, how the roots work, etc. Not only easier, but it makes it much more enjoyable.
One important thing I learned was understanding that investigating and reading guides from successful orchid growers will minimize loss, but not avoid it altogether. For our plants to thrive, which ultimately is what we want, we need to understand our growth space, our conditions, and our limitations. It's always painful to lose an orchid, but as long as we learn something, it was ultimately worth it. By understanding what went wrong, we can decide if we should give it another chance, or if that plant just isn't for us.
Another thing I learned pretty fast is that even though when we start we think of orchid flowers, probably because when we start we are mostly aware of phalaenopsis and their humongous flowers, but the best way to enjoy them is as plants, and the flowers are just a bonus. I found myself very early on getting excited about a new leaf, a new growth, a new root, and now I have a lot of them that I got just because I found the foliage interesting or pretty, and I don't even care that much if they flower. I hope you enjoyed this trip down memory lane. We focused a lot more on the orchid growing part than having this channel, but we want to thank each and every one of you that enjoys our videos and leave us nice comments. Between talking to our viewers and watching other orchid channels, it does give us a nice sense of community in the hobby, and for that we appreciate you all so much.
And if you want to keep up with our orchid collection, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And we'll see you next week for another video.
Goodbye.